welcome to the second episode of the series here on the Svarim Cheddar podcast, The Reception of the Zohar, a History. I'm Nachi Weinstein. Episode 2 picks up where we left off at the beginning of the early modern period, focusing on Arinaya and other texts and figures, and we'll end with the 18th century, where episode 3 will pick up with Rav Yaakov Emden. This episode of the series is anonymously sponsored by a friend of the podcast in honor of the birth of his son. To sponsor an episode or to support the show, you can email me, svarimcheddar@gmail.com, or check out the links and information in the show's notes. You can also check out a link in the show's notes to the Svarim Cheddar WhatsApp community, where I post about new Svarim, new books, book deals, and so on. You can also subscribe and rate the podcast, whether you listen Apple, Spotify, 24/6, wherever it is that you listen. And I look forward to hearing more feedback from the listeners, what you think. And with that, enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Cheddar podcast, and the second episode on the ongoing mini-series here on the podcast, The Reception of the Zohar, a History, with JJ Kimche. The last episode of the series, we started off with the beginning, with the introductory statements that we went through, the overview of the Zohar and of the question and of various things. And we worked through the first generation of the Zohar being revealed and the first comments and Rishonim in an early period. And we ended really with Rabbi Yodel Medigo, Bechinas Hadas, and then we ended at the Gerush Sfarad and the role that Gerush Sfarad, the expulsion of Spain, of the Jews of Spain in 1492, and the role that that played in the dissemination, really in the expansion of Kabbalah, specifically the Zohar, for this series, throughout the world, and what role that played. And so that's where we'll start episode 2 with, and thank you, JJ, for joining me once again.
A pleasure, Nachi, a pleasure. It's been a long time, a whole 10 minutes since you recorded the previous one.
You're not supposed to give that away to the listeners.
My apologies. We tend to do these marathons. Okay, so yes, as you mentioned, we stopped just before Gerush Sfarad 1492. Of course, the expulsion of Jews from Spain, the destruction of the world's largest, most productive, most fruitful, most extraordinary Jewish community at the time, was a blow from which Judaism and Jewry arguably took centuries to recover, if it ever did, and of course changed the landscape, the sort of the social landscape, the demographic landscape, the religious landscape, the intellectual landscape for the centuries to come. And one of the major results of the expulsion from Spain was the spreading of the Zohar, specifically Kabbalah and specifically the Zohar, to places all over the world, and really began a whole new era of Kabbalistic and Zoharic writing and spread, and of course that engendered opposition to the Kabbalah, opposition to the Zohar, etc., which we are going to go over in the coming hour. So why was Gerush Sfarad so important? So the first thing, of course, is that many of those who were studying Kabbalah, who were writing it, who were who had the text themselves, they were themselves expelled from Spain. So of course it was the expulsion, the literal dispersion of the people, of the human beings who had expertise, who were interested in this, who were involved in this, who had the Kabbalistic traditions. They were expelled from Spain. They went all over the place. Some Jews in Spain were, wound up in Italy. Some wound up in the Ottoman Empire. Some eventually made their way to Eastern Europe. Some, to Amsterdam, to London, to all over the place. And there was, of course, to the New World, to what is now the United States, or to North America. And therefore, the literal spread of the Kabbalistic text and Kabbalists was the major result of the expulsion of Jews from Spain. There was also as I mentioned in the previous episode a little bit, the expulsion from Spain spelled a kind of death blow to Jewish philosophy, to rationalist Jewish philosophy, which really, to have a kind of a good cultural synthesis between religion and between philosophy requires certain conditions to be met, namely, acceptance within society, access to broader education, acceptance to a certain limited degree, certainly among the outside world, and of course, the expulsion from Spain and the eventual the migration of Jews into countries that were often a lot less amenable to Jewish existence and to parts of the world in which Jews had to accept a form of living or a mode of existence which was much more insular, which was much less involved with the outside world, which had much less interaction with the outside world. That, of course, also had a major impact on Jewish ideas, and specifically the suppression, as it were, of a certain cultural and certain philosophical enrichment, and in this case, a Jewish philosophy as it was known in the medieval period. There was also a theory of Gershom Shalom, which ought to be mentioned here, and that's been opposed by many others, which is that Jews who were expelled from Spain and who saw the destruction of Spain and shortly afterwards Portugal as well, we saw the destruction of these major Jewish communities and the absolute havoc and death and terrible conditions into which the hundreds of thousands of Jews were put. This created a certain psychological need, right? A need to interpret what was going on in a way that was spiritually and psychologically satisfying. Okay, these events couldn't just be stun. They couldn't be something that happened for no reason or for the banal reasons of politics and economics. The historians tend to ascribe events, but rather it needed to have a certain theological mooring to it, a certain a grounding in a cosmic processes and cosmic events. And in Shalom's eyes, that was also part of the great Kabbalistic revival of the century following Girush Sfarad, which is that Jews who were looking at the expulsion of Jews from Spain and the generally terrible conditions that Jews found themselves across the world had to come up with reasons for it, and had to come up with invent or essentially construct a theological, or adopt at least a theological framework which allowed them to see it as more than just their own circumstances, but rather part of great titanic battles between forces of good and evil that spread across the entirety of creation and within the divinity itself, etc., etc. I don't want to go too much into it, but basically he interpreted the great rise of Zoharic Kabbalah in the century after Girush Sfarad as answering this deep psychological religious need that was on the part of many Jews at the time. So those were some of the causes or rather some of the consequences of the expulsion from Spain. There was also, of course, concomitantly at that time period as well within Europe, one of the most consequential, most far-reaching technical inventions in the history of humanity, namely printing. And I'm sure there have been many guests previously on your podcast who have talked about printing and the invention of printing in the late 1400s and the early 1500s, and the enormous spread of information that was possible by printing. I mean, just to give an idea to your audience, before printing, writing a book was something akin to now what you'd imagine writing a Sefer Torah, right? Very long, very painful, had to be done. It took an enormous amount of time. It was expensive. You had to have professional scribes doing it. It was really lengthy and laborious, and therefore you couldn't have that many copies of books. I mean, who was rich enough to have copies of books? And basically the survival of books and the spreading of books was very painful, very slow, and very difficult. Whereas after printing, it was much cheaper, much quicker, much easier. All you had to have was the impress of the pages of the book, and suddenly you could print thousands of them, send them to all corners of the world, have them appear everywhere. And suddenly you had, again, within the space of a few decades, firstly, just the sheer quantities of books that existed in Europe and around the world, was increased by magnitudes, factors that are never seen before. And secondly, the access to it of people in far-flung places was also unprecedented, and it was this massive explosion of knowledge and the access to knowledge on the part of people, which underwrote, of course, the European Reformation and the Lutheran Reformation, later on the Enlightenment, and basically many of the spread of ideas and the revolutionary processes in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. All of this was dependent upon the quick and easy dissemination of knowledge based upon printing. Yes.
First of all, just as a side, it's interesting you talk about print, on a podcast being called Svarim Chatter. I actually haven't done enough about print and Gutenberg and movable type.
You must rectify this. This is unforgivable.
Absolutely. You mentioned the invention of the printing press and movable type. Obviously, there was printing earlier in the East and in China and other lands. We know there was earlier than that even. But yeah, there's a lot to talk about there. It's very technical, and it's better with video. Maybe that's why I haven't done it. But I definitely should do it. There's definitely a lot that has to be talked about, especially early Hebrew printing in Kabbalah. Very important. So this is something that's important, definitely, that I have to talk more about. And
perhaps your next mini-series.
Yeah, maybe that. Listeners think it's a good idea. But we're going to get to in a second the printing controversy around the Zohar, because that's going to be a question, and there's a really good chapter in Boaz Huss's book about it. But I just want to mention, I think you mentioned this, that the dissemination of Kabbalah and Zohar that comes about with Girush Sfarad, and also the end of the philosophy, really kind of, it doesn't end, but the ending philosophy here doesn't do well, Jewish philosophy after this. And this is something, it's also interesting that this is something that is discussed in the Chassid Yavitz, the basic Yavitz, that are familiar to a lot of people with his commentary on Pirkei Avos, but in one of his other Sfarim, forgetting which one offhand, he he talks about, he blames the Gerus Farad on philosophy and on the Jews reading philosophy, and that he's famously blames a lot of that happened to them and converting Christianity because of philosophy.
Yes, yeah. And the truth is that there are many reasons for this decline. There's also the decline, incidentally, of other forms of Jewish productivity or creativity. For example, Parshanut, really, Pirush Torah. I mean, you have the Barbanel, and you have a little bit of Vadio Sforno, but for 2 or 3 centuries, that also goes into an abeyance after Girush Farad. It's very Girush Farad had a very a seismic impact on Jewish ideas, both the kinds of ideas and the genres of ideas and the production of knowledge. And yes, this is certainly a subject for a much, much longer and lengthier series, and therefore we're not going to dwell on it here. So the Zohar was eventually printed. Actually, it took several decades for the Zohar to be printed. Printed in 2 Italian cities, Cremona and Mantua, in the 1550s. And that, of course, was momentous for several reasons. Firstly, because, as I said before, suddenly you could print many hundreds, thousands of copies and send them everywhere relatively quickly, relatively cheaply, and suddenly within a few decades you had the Zohar as a presence on bookshelves in people's libraries, in Batei Midrashim, in synagogues, etc., across the world. That's one important thing. But much more importantly, actually, is that with printing, the Zohar becomes a book, which it never had been before. And this is something that recent Zohar scholarship, especially people like Daniel Abrams and Ronit Meroz and others, have pointed out, is that prior to printing in the 1550s, the Zohar was much more a loose collection of texts. And not only was it a loose collection of texts, much more so, it was a set of live texts. Okay, this is actually a very important point to make and something that everyone should know, which is that a live text, what I mean by that is that you have a text which had to be, of course, pre-printing, had to be copied in each generation by scribes, by copyists, etc. But the problem is that when these scribes would do their work, they would often add or edit or amend or subtract things that were in the text they were writing, right? Or sometimes they would see a marginal note and put it in the main body of the text. Or sometimes you see something in the body of the text, and when they copied it, put it out in a marginal note. And therefore, what you had with the Zohar, along with many other books, is many, many different copies, many different versions, actually, of various Zoharic texts. And in fact, when in recent years, when Daniel Matt and his fellows at the Pritzker, who want to produce the new Pritzker translation of the Zohar by Stanford University Press. So one of the first things that Daniel Matt had to do, and this is an extraordinary thing, is go through all the various pre-printing Zohar manuscripts and find and basically create a stable text of the Zohar. Because there is no, and this is sort of a punchline, but there is no the Zohar really before printing, and even after printing. It's not the Zohar. There are versions of the Zohar that eventually came to be accepted, but in fact, there are many, many different, subtly different, and sometimes not so subtly different versions of the Zohar prior to printing, because as I said, it was a live text. People were adding, people were subtracting, people were putting all sorts of things in there, taking all sorts of things out. And that, of course, is very important for the development of Zohar criticism, as we'll get to later on. And it's a little bit analogous. I mean, many of your listeners might know, for example, Pirush Rashi al HaTorah, right? There are, in fact, there are hundreds of pre-printing manuscripts of it, many of which are very different from each other. And in fact, it's a whole cottage industry among Rashi scholars nowadays to try and to try and sort of reverse engineer this and try and get back to what is the original copy of the Rashi script, because we have hundreds of manuscripts by copyists and copyists of copyists, etc., all of them saying something different. So the printing of the Zohar was a crucial step in the dissemination and the study of the Zohar, not only because it literally put the Zohar cheaply and effectively all over the world, but more importantly, it created the Zohar. The Zohar was now suddenly a stable book that could be studied and cross-referenced and quoted in various places, and people would have more or less, I mean, obviously there are different versions of it, but more or less the same version of these Zoharic texts. So the printing was powerful. Now, the truth is, as you mentioned, there was a controversy of the printing. It is a good chapter, as in Husser's book. I'm not going to dwell on it very much. What I would say is that it's interesting to say that in the early printings of the Zohar, you have these introductions by the Motzi'ei La'or, by the printers, by the publishers, basically responding to those who clearly had objected. In other words, funnily enough, we don't have so much evidence of those who objected to the printing, much more evidence by those who responded to the objectors of the printing, and basically, defending their right to print and disseminate and etc. Those things, and create the Zohar book as we have it at the time. But so that is the Zohar printing Aregel Achat, and much more interestingly is that is what was going on roughly at the same time in the same decades in the great flowering of Kabbalah and Kabbalistic thought that took place in the 16th century. And of course, I'm referring to the city in Eretz Israel of Tzfat, right, of Safed in Israel, where in about not a very long period of time, about 3 or 4 decade periods, they had a very intense golden age where you had some of the most brilliant, the most creative, the most fruitful scholars in the Jewish world at the time converging there, studying there, discussing things with each other there, and creating some of the most important texts and the most important ideas which continue to demarcate Jewish life until this day, was created in the mid-16th century, the mid-1500s, in Zohar, in Tzfat, which at the time, for a brief period of time, was an economic hotspot. It was a powerhouse of textile manufacture and export. And there was attracted some of the most important scholars. And I'll say 2 major points. The first is that some of these scholars, they did 2 things. First, what happened to Zoharic text then in Tzfat was a systematization for the first time of the Zoharic text, because it's important to remember that I spoke earlier a little bit about the doctrines, the SS Sfirot and other such things, but the truth is that the Zohar is a very unsystematic text. It is a midrashic text, which means there are stories and there are ambiguous statements and puns and word plays and texts that are difficult to parse exactly, and so therefore it is very difficult actually to make any kind of organized, systematic, principle-based set of doctrines on the Zoharic text. It's extremely difficult, and Kabbalistic texts in general were written usually, again, there's some much more systematic, but usually they're written in a very in that kind of opaque manner prior to the 16th century. However, in Tzfat, for the first time, really in a major way, you had figures like Rav Moshe Cordovero, the Ramak, who took it upon themselves not only to comment and to write commentaries and to explicate these Kabbalistic texts, but actually to systematize them and to create a body of thought, a body of doctrines based on the Kabbalistic text, the Zohar, which is of course a very important stage in the Zoharic process. And you also had the great elaboration of the Zoharic worldview, mainly by, of course, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, the Ari or the Arizal, and his later disciples. And these figures, including Ramak, including the Arizal, they clearly understood the Zohar to be ancient, to be from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and of course, it helped very much. Part of the popularity of Kabbalah in those days is that they were literally sitting in the Galil, right? Tzfat is in the north of Israel, and geographically, it's right there, right? You are a stone's throw away from Miron. You're a stone's throw away from all the hills in which Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Akiva, and all these other people were supposed to have been wandering and supposed to have, all the exploits recorded in the Zohar happen in your backyard. And of course, Tzfat, then became ascribed the graves of many important figures by the Arizal, one way or another. We won't go into that right now. But the point being that that was of course an important part of the spread of the Zohar, which is number one, the systematization of his doctrines, and number two, the elaboration, the based upon the Zohar, a very elaborate cosmology, a very elaborate eschatology, a very elaborate system of ideas of the Arizal, which came to a certain degree to dominate and to be highly influential on later Jewish mystics and Chassidut and Shabtaot and all other elements of Jewish mystical thought. And so that's one very important development that happened in Tzfat in the time. But of course, the other very important development is the entering of the Zohar into mainstream halacha. Okay, and this is, of course, an extremely important development because, of course, the Zohar, not having been published before the late 1200s, so in many of some of the earlier classic halachic texts, most notably, of course, the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam, the Zohar and Zoharic ideas and Zoharic halachot don't appear. I mean, they're not heard of, they're not understood, they weren't recorded then. However, by the time Rav Yosef Karo was writing his Shulchan Aruch in Tzfat at that time, the same time as the Ari, slightly before the Arizal, but whatever. But at the same time as Ramosh Cordovero and others, by that time there was this influx. Now, I'll say a couple of things about that. Firstly, one mustn't imagine that the Zohar came to dominate the halachic system until it wasn't imported at a very large scale. I'd say at a reasonable or some elements of Zoharic and Kabbalistic, halachot or ideas that I mentioned there do make their way into halachic sources. Again, they don't supplant, they do not replace the Talmud, they do not replace the Mishnah Torah, but they do make their way. So, I mean, the most obvious difference, for example, between the Mishnah Torah and the Shulchan Aruch, I mean, there are many, but in terms of these mystical halachot, one of them is that according to the Rambam, when you wake up in the morning, the first thing you do is you start saying brachot, right? You start blessing. You say, you stand up and you say Zokef Kufafim, and you put on clothes, say Mabisharim nodes. You start immediately blessing, and then you wash your hands as a preparation for proper tefillah later on, right? Whereas, of course, in the many of these listeners will know, you open the Shulchan Aruch, the first thing you can't even move, think, blink, do anything. You have to wash your hands. Why? Because of ruach ra'ah, because of this spirit that's supposed to descend on your hands during the night. Again, is this a massive change in halacha? Not really, but this is clearly a Kabbalistic idea which the Rambam had never heard of, which made its way into the halachic corpus. There are other examples as well. For example, the whole debate over tefillin on Chol HaMoed, yes or no. So Zohar is dead against wearing a tefillin on Chol HaMoed, and that made its way into the halachic sources at the time. And there are many examples of this. I have to say, as an aside, philosophically speaking, right? It is philosophically speaking, Kabbalah is actually very amenable. It's a very good framework for halacha, and I'll explain what I mean. If you read the philosophical sources of Judaism, if you read, let's say, the Moreh Nevuchim or other such philosophical texts, so it's actually quite difficult to see how the small details of the halachic system, how they are granted meaning, how they are given, how important they are, right? So, as an example, according to the Rambam, what is his Ta'amei HaMitzvot? What is the point of the mitzvah according to the Rambam? It is basically to perfect oneself, to perfect one's society, to perfect the body, to perfect the midot, the virtues, the attributes, and finally to perfect your intellect, to perfect your mind, and give it correct beliefs, right? And so, therefore, there are a bunch of mitzvahs and a bunch of halachas that are geared towards this. But does it matter if you So, for example, you can say blowing the shofar or shaking the lulav, or whatever it is, that has some sort of effect, or that is useful to some degree in the overall picture of perfecting one's own self, or perfecting one's own society, or perfecting one's own intellect, or whatever it is. But the small details, do they matter so much? So the truth is that in the philosophical mindset, they don't really. And in fact, explicitly, the Rambam mentions at that place, when it comes to korbanot, sacrifices, why, don't ask why 2 and not 3, because if we were commanded 3, you'd be asked why not 4, and if 4, why not 5? In other words, the small details, although they are there and they are commanded, they're not given within a philosophical framework necessarily such grand importance. Whereas the opposite is true in a Kabbalistic framework. Kabbalistic framework, every single tiny detail of the mitzvah, every kavanah, every shake of the lulav and esrog, every blow of the shofar, every small action and intention is given cosmic significance, because every action is allowing the person to basically make rectifications, to move or to harmonize the energies within the spherotic apparatus, as it were, and therefore, literally to l'shem yichud kudsha bricho shchinte, right? It unites the divine entities and therefore brings blessing into the upper realms and consequently into the lower realms, into the world itself. And therefore, Kabbalah is a much more conducive framework, philosophical framework, in a way, to conceive of the smaller details of halacha. And of course, as you're codifying the halachot, the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, etc., and the Magen Avraham and the Shach and the etc., they're all going, they're all writing on the very small details of halacha. So to have a Kabbalistic component underwriting all this is very helpful, is very useful. So anyway, that was somewhat interesting aside. And so what you have in Tzfat at the time is, again, the systematization of doctrines based on the Zohar, the elaboration of sort of mystical doctrines by the Arizal and others, and of course of Chaim Vital and those who came after him, and you also had the entering of the Zohar or certain Zoharic details or doctrines into the halachic system, and that is that is of great import, and that of course all of those in Tzfat were assuming pshuto kamashma'o that the Zohar was written, in fact, by Rishon Bar Yochai, by his disciples, and that's what gave it such important weight, such that we can base some halachas of it, such that we can base our doctrines off it, such that it can serve as the central pillar in the development of Jewish ideas.
So you mentioned before the printing and the print controversies. I mentioned the chapter in Boaz Huss's book, and that in the 1550s, the Mantua, the Cremona. So with that also, I'll mention the Rabbi Dr. David Katz. He did a few podcast episodes about this. I know when I think Gnazdim sold one of the early editions, and I know that he did a podcast series, and then you can check that out if you want to hear more about that specific controversy, whether to print or not to print. And there were those on each side, yes, print it, don't print it. The whole back and forth. But as you say, and also as you say, becoming a set book of text, this is something that has come up in other areas. One a similar, totally different thing that comes to mind at the same time, a podcast episode that I've recorded. I haven't released yet. We'll see if it's released by the time this comes out on Sefer Hasidim. The book recently came out about this. And taking something, and Sefer Hasidim is obviously unique in this regard because it's totally different manuscripts and it's totally different books, and it gets put together and it gets printed. So what we consider a book between two boards of a published book, it similarly happens to the Zohar, where you have the Zohar and then later on we have Tikkunim and then the Zohar Chadash, and it keeps coming and things keep getting differently beyond the defined. But as you said, gets put together in a defined set of. Now anyone says the Zohar, they're referring to that specific printed edition. I mean, until today, people reference that specific edition. You have it that's printed there, putting aside other manuscripts and other things, because obviously there was a lot going on with that. And this is important as we get later on to, especially Yaakov Emden is going to suggest a lot of, textual changes and Girsa changes besides for attacks on the Zohar going on this printed Zohar when we get to Mitbachas Varim and Yaakov Emden in episode 3, I believe, but we'll get to that. So now we're here, you mentioned Tzfas, you mentioned the as it moves into Halacha, and this is something that later on also it gets more in the Magen Avraham and other things. This is going to get much more. You mentioned Tefillin. Tefillin becomes a real controversial, not controversial. I mean, there's always a controversy around this. I'm thinking of this happens much later on, Romano Chayriki, and there's his whole Tefillin to Marioma. He writes a whole sefer about this, and Shishim Porgur, Shemer Sadaka writes back, and there's a whole yes, Tefillin, not. And I think in Rabbi B'yam Shlomo Hamburger's Shoshim Gnig Ashkenaz, volume 5, where he talks all about Tefillin, a whole massive fat volume about it, and there's a lot of you can read all about this whole Tefillin Chalamoid, yes, no. And this whole, obviously, the Gaon knows Tefillin Chalamoid, or Tzral, they don't do Tefillin Chalamoid, of course. Yeah, there's a lot more to get into. Not for now, just as you mentioned, you were mentioning about the halachic aspect of Kabbalah in halacha. Anyway, back to where you were.
Back to our narrative. Okay, so. However, you have these developments. However, as I mentioned, there doesn't seem to be much of a debate at all, at least not that I can see within those circles in Tzfat, about the antiquity and the authenticity of the Zohar itself. However, this debate was raging in the 16th century, or 16th and 17th century, but this took place across the Mediterranean Sea in the Italian peninsula. Now, it's not an exaggeration to say that in many ways the Italian peninsula, both in the Jewish world and the non-Jewish world, becomes possibly in those centuries the major center of intellectual activity, right? And so what you have, people are aware of the Renaissance and the beginnings of the scientific revolution. Figures like Galileo and Pico della Mirandola, as I mentioned, and others, and Leonardo da Vinci, and all the great Italian masters and Renaissance men and humanists of various sorts. And you have that world. And what's interesting, also, you had a great age of extraordinary Jewish intellectuals as well. In the 1600s, men like Azaria de Rossi, like Eliyahu HaBachor or Elijah Levita, Ravaggio Sforno, Leone Ebreo, and many others. And you had this extraordinary profusion of Jews who were, on the one hand, very well versed in all areas of Jewish text, Tanakh and the Talmud, etc., Kabbalah, and you also had, but who were also publishing extraordinary works of, very scientifically literate, very philosophically literate, and really the Italian peninsula, because of that, becomes the stage for discussing whether or not Kabbalah belongs in this kind of in a I would say, culturally sophisticated, intellectually wide-ranging kind of Judaism, is there a place for Kabbalah, yes or no? And the truth is that this becomes a debate between two extremely important men in Italy at the time, which one is, as you mentioned before, Yashar of Candia, Yosef Shlomo del Medigo, and the other was, not Azar Shirazi, but rather Leon di Modena, Yehuda Ari of Modena, and each of which composing a tract, one way and the other, about Kabbalah and about the Zohar. I'm going to go through them a little bit because this is really one of the most fascinating stages of our whole narrative. So let's begin a little bit with Yashar of Candia, not to be confused with Yashar of Gorizia, which we'll get to later on. But Yashar of Candia, Yosef Shlomo del Medigo, who was a descendant of some kind of Eliyahu del Medigo, and he in fact published his book. And he was actually he was a brilliant man. He was a scientist. He was a student of Galileo. He actually records him looking through the telescope. Imagine being taught astronomy by the greatest astronomer, one of the greats of all time, Galileo, and also a writer of various brilliant works in Hebrew, of Jewish works, non-Jewish works, a philosopher, really quite an extraordinary figure. And so he publishes the work of his Alter Zeda, Eliyahu del Medigo. So Yashar publishes that, along with what he sees as a refutation, which he called the Matzref L'Chochma. Okay. This is, again, quite a beautiful and brilliant work in Hebrew as well. So there are a few very important facets of this work I want to get to. The first is that it is a syncretistic work. What do I mean by that? It means that basically what Yashar tries to do is say that Kabbalah, when read a certain way, actually dovetails very well with medieval science and medieval philosophy, and actually fits very well with the best and most advanced knowledge of his time, of the Renaissance period, and that's part of its credence. It's part of its beauty, and it's why we should. That's why we should pay attention. So, he points out how the Sfirot are very close to the doctrines of what are called the Neoplatonists, right? Which is true, and how the concept of Gilgul, the concept of transmigration, of reincarnation of the souls, is very close to Pythagorean doctrine as well. And he sort of makes these kinds of hashva, these comparisons with science, with philosophy. Now, I want to make a little aside, a short excursus. This is one of the big questions that dogs this whole narrative, which is the relationship between Kabbalah and medieval science, medieval philosophy, and whether or not that's a good thing. Okay, some say, and of course there are those on each side. Some say Kabbalah and philosophy completely different, nothing to do with each other, and that's good for Kabbalah. And some say, no, that's bad for Kabbalah. And there are others who, like Yashar of Kandia, who are syncretists, who say, no, philosophy and Kabbalah are actually very similar, and that's good. Whereas later on we'll get to Shadal, who say, no, philosophy and Kabbalah are very similar, and that's very bad for Kabbalah. So basically you have, on the syncretistic and anti-syncretistic side, both people who claim both, and also people who celebrate or disparage Kabbalah based on whether or not they like philosophy of the medieval period. We're going to get to that in more detail later. It's just an interesting point. But for Yashar of Kandia, philosophy, Kabbalah bears the imprint of medieval science, medieval philosophy, and that's wonderful. It's brilliant. That shows how connected it is and how sort of culturally and philosophically sophisticated it is, and that's very important for him. He goes on to try and defend in various ways his various accusations leveled by the B'chinat Hadat. So the first is the problem of the gap. Right? Why is it not mentioned anywhere in the Talmud, anywhere in the Gaonim, etc.? So one of his arguments is that Zohar isn't mentioned in the Gemara because that's not what the Gemara deals with. That's not the genre. He says that also carpentry isn't mentioned in the Gemara, and also how to build a ship isn't mentioned in the Gemara. Why? It's not what the Gemara is interested in. It's not what it does. It's not what it sees as its role, and therefore don't be surprised if you don't find in Talmudic literature things that don't belong there, the things the rabbis aren't interested in. Okay, that was one part of his defense. And also again, he says not in the Gaonim because the Gaonim, even though they knew of Kabbalah, they didn't express themselves in that way. They didn't express themselves that way in the idiom of the time. It basically tries to get past it. Interestingly, with the composition of the Zohar itself, so Del Medico tries to, or I should say Yashar, as not to confuse him with his ancestor, but Yashar of Kandia, he adopts some sort of middle approach in which he says, listen, it seems that there are some slightly later accretions. It might have been edited by later people, which is why you find Amoraim in the Zohar, because it was edited in the time of the Amoraim in Bavel, and maybe even like the Gemara, it might have been edited by the Savoraim, right? And basically, what you have is a kind of a theory of gradual editing of the Zohar, which is actually important, which helps him answer why there seems to be some anachronisms. Now, of course, he still thinks that the vast majority is Rishon Bar Yochai, and he still thinks that it is, faithfully recording the doctrines and the sayings and the doings of those who are living in the Tannaitic period. But he starts to open up the door for a little bit of later doctrines. Agav, worth mentioning, that he lived in the period of Italian humanists who were doing exactly the same things to ancient texts in the Greco-Roman tradition, right? Part of what was going on in 15th, 16th century Italy, 17th century Italy, is the turning of various humanists like Petrarch to the older Latin and Greek texts, and also doing a kind of textual analysis and saying, okay, was this text legitimate? Is this text, really written when it's supposed to have been written? And trying to use the tools of philology and the tools of history to try and gain a closer understanding of when texts were written. So anyway, but that's another point. He opens the door ever so slightly. Now, how does he answer the question of whether or not why halachically Rishon Bar Yochai isn't recognized as the great figure, the great sage, and why the halacha isn't like him in every circumstance. He brings up the story, the famous Gemara Bava Metzia, of the story of the Tanur Shel Achnai, right? The story that everyone knows, one of the most famous stories in Gemara between the rabbis, where basically it was Rabbi Eliezer who stated a certain opinion, and the Chachamim disagreed. And even though by a series of miracles, Rabbi Eliezer proved that he was correct, nonetheless, the Chachamim decided that the halacha was in fact like them. They quoted the pasuk Lo Bashamayim. There's a famous story there, and I'm not going to go into it too much, but essentially. But essentially, that is the story there. And what Yashar of Kandia was saying was that Rabbi Shimon functioned as this Rabbi Eliezer figure. In other words, really, the halacha should have been like him. However, within the rabbinic process, the halacha is acharei rabim lahatos, that you go after the majority, right? And therefore, you don't. You can have one member of the rabbinic sort of quorum who has a superior opinion, but nonetheless, if others disagree with him, then it is then you go by the majority, even if the majority are wrong. And that's how he defends it. He says that Rishon Bar Yochai really, because he knew all the secrets of the Torah, really halacha should have been like him. However, that's not how halachic decisions are reached. That's not how rabbinic judicial processes function, and therefore that and therefore he sort of pushes aside that. Interestingly, towards the end of the book. Of this work, he lists a very long list of halachic differences between the Zohar and the Talmud. I mentioned tefillin before, whether an eved is chayav in mitzvahs or not, etc. And basically, he says that he will deal with these many halachic differences between the Zohar and the Talmud. He says he will deal with them elsewhere, but really, we don't have any record of him trying to do so. Now. And again, this is Areg Lachad, but this was his attempt to try and deal with some of the issues brought up by the Bechinas Hadat, and basically say that no, actually Kabbalah is not anti-philosophical. It is in fact, very much closely allied with science and philosophy. That in fact, there is a good reason why no one mentioned it, why there's this great gap, and really why there can be maybe some later accretions and some explanation for the anachronisms with the Zohar, and the reason why Rishon Bar Yochai isn't this sort of pillar of halachic, of sort of the mainstay of the halachic tradition as we have it now. This is the story of the Matzrif LaChochma. However, things get a little complicated in the 19th century. Why did they get complicated? Because of a book brought out in 1840 by Abraham Geiger. Abraham Geiger, one of the leading figures of Reform Judaism, and also one of the great Wissenschaftler, one of the great Germanic historians of Judaism at the time. So one of the things that he did is that he went around to libraries of manuscripts and basically rescued the manuscripts and typed them up and brought out manuscripts that he claims to have found by previous figures, etc. That's one of the things he was involved in. In 1840, he brings out a book called Meloch Hafnaim, in which he prints the full version, at least what he claims, this is what Geiger claims, is the full version of a letter written by Yashar of Kandia to one of his Talmids called Igeret Achuz, And basically, this is a full version of a letter, and this is a very anti-Kabbalistic, anti-Zoharic letter. In other words, this is according to this letter, this is where Yashar of Kandia really says his true opinion on the matter, right? According to Geiger, Yashar of Kandia wrote the initial book as a kind of defense of Kabbalah, but didn't really mean it. He was writing it for his patrons. He was writing it sort of to cover himself from any objections or any possible accusations of heresy. But his true opinion was in this longer, full version of a letter he wrote to his the and therefore, that's what he really, that was his true opinion. And the truth is, there's an argument to this day among academics, among scholars, of who is the true Yosef Shlomo del Medico? Who is the true Italian Renaissance scientist, philosopher? Is it the great defender of the Zohar, the great defender of Kabbalah, as we see in the Matzrof Chochmah, or is it someone who appeared to be that way, but really his true opinion was much like many of his other colleagues within the scientific philosophical world, which was that mysticism and Kabbalah was actually untrustworthy and not representative of some sort of ancient Jewish tradition. So this is, and this remains today, a bone of contention certainly in the academic world, and I imagine, I haven't heard of it from within the rabbinic world, but those who do study it, I'm sure, will have strong opinions on the topic.
Well, I think it isn't clear. As you're saying, Geiger was obviously going to be anti-Zohar, obviously being the head of leader reform in Germany at the time. And so it's not clear that this letter is real or not. He claims it was. It's very not clear. So this could be, forgery of Geiger's. Definitely possible. Or
it could be a forgery of Geiger's, or Geiger could genuinely have found this letter, but it was written by someone else. In other words, it was signed by Shlomo Domingo. It could be Geiger thought it was completely real, but who knows? Forgeries could take place in any century, and there's no way of knowing.
Absolutely, there's definitely questions around this, and so Matzah of the Chochmah is available in Hebrew books. You can get the originals with Talumas Chochmas with a bunch of different books, and it's Matzah Chochmah that was printed in Odessa. There was another version. That is on Hebrew books. You mentioned about the rabbinic world. I think Yashar is not really so well known. I mentioned Sefer Elim is his classic book published by Menashe ben Israel. It's not his farm. I think it hasn't been redone properly. He isn't really that well known. I remember about a year and a half ago, when I was in Europe and on a tour, and we were in Prague. And I was asking around, where, how can I get? We were in the old cemetery, and Yashar of Kandia is buried in Prague. He ended up in his life. He's buried in Prague. And I asked, it was like a local tour guide, and I said, how can I get to the kever? And it's the only guy that asked him. And he's like, oh, he's somewhere else. You have to get special permission to go there. Prague is like one of the roped off, the old cemetery, hard to get to. And we weren't able to get there. And I was asking a couple other people, and they're like, who? I don't know who you're talking about. Who?
Right.
Like, they didn't know who Yashar Vikandi was. We have a picture of him. Actually, he's got that big sombrero. You can see the picture of him. There's like that famous picture of him. Whether it's real or not, I don't know. But so, he isn't, unfortunately, not a well-known figure. But in this story, he definitely plays a big role.
Okay, so much for Yashar of Kandia. And now we're going to move on to the other great fascinating Italian figure of the time who addressed this issue of the antiquity and the authority of Kabbalah, which is Yehuda Aryeh, or Leon of Modena. A very interesting figure in general. He is, again, a sort of a Renaissance man, someone who dabbled in many different topics, many different fields, wrote a lot, covered a very broad spectrum of everything from philosophy to various kinds of Renaissance humanistic topics, etc. He was also, interestingly, a rabbi in the Venice ghetto, and a preacher. And apparently his power of speech and power of rhetoric was so famous and so widespread that non-Jews used to come into the ghetto on Shabbos and Yom Tov to actually hear him speak inside the shul, which is, not too many rabbis in history, I think, whose fame extends that far, that members of non-Jewish people would actually flock to hear them give their opinions. He also wrote a fascinating and very revealing autobiography called Chayei Yehuda, and this is very interesting because it is the first great really Jewish autobiography at all. Certainly the first great rabbinic autobiography, but following him, certainly in the 18th and 19th century, you have many more Jewish intellectuals who turn around and pen a sort of an account of their life, a full and unsparing account of their life. And Yehuda of Modena talked about his problems with his family and his gambling addiction and all sorts of things that he had. In addition to his, it's a fascinating portrait because it complements his intellectual brilliance. with sort of quite a difficult and turbulent life, I would say. Anyway, so he addressed this question of the antiquity and the authority of Kabbalah, and specifically the Zohar, in a book called, yes?
I just want to jump in. Just sorry, before you get to his bio, I just wanted to say...
Before I get there, okay.
Exactly. One thing on his bio. So I did a podcast episode a number of years ago already with Professor Edelman, who was involved. I think there was a dissertation on it, and he was involved with there's a new really nice English translation with some essays in the beginning, and then it has the edited notes. That's the autobiography of the 17th century Venetian rabbi. Yes, Leon Modern's Life of Judah. Interesting, he's always called Yehuda Yedi Modern, Adam Modern, but he actually is from Venice. Like his family originally came from there. And Rabbi Aaron Brachia, the Maver Yaboik, who is a big Kabbalist, his cousin, who he talks about, he lives in Modena. He's the rabbi in Modena. So the years also, we're talking like 1571 to 1648, just to give listeners kind of a bearings of where he is and when he's living, and he's in Venice. And his autobiography is fascinating. I think he's become like more well known as like the gambling rabbi and whatever goes on in there, even though Ari Noam is kind of this book that we're going to talk about. That, by the way, I think I said this on the first episode, it circulates in manuscript, so it's not actually published until the 19th century. The Maskilim pick it up and they run with it, and we'll get
correct.
there. Now,
we shall get there.
Yes, exactly. Okay, terrific. So now back to where you were saying.
Right. Okay. So he addresses this topic in a book called Ari Nohem, which, as it was only published later on, but it really is from was republished later on, but really from its very inception, is I would say, major founding work of this genre of Kabbalah criticism. I mean, obviously you had Eliyahu Del Medigo before, and others who I mentioned as well, but really Ari Nohem is the founding figure in the sense that he expresses the major critiques, most of them, and he expresses them in a clear and compelling manner. And he also, it's done in such a way that isn't, his goal isn't to fatally undermine the Zohar as a work. In fact, he actually quite liked the Zohar in a funny way. He thought it was very beautiful, and he thought it was religiously enriching in many ways, and he thought it was useful and important for people to read. But he saw it not at all as a work of an ancient work, a work by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and therefore carrying massive weight, theological weight, mystical weight, halachic weight, but rather as a medieval mystical midrash, similar to, let's say, I don't know, a late midrash rabbah or something like that, which again is useful and can be beautiful and can be enriching, but is not, doesn't carry the same antiquity as a book written by a Tana. So this book, yes, the Ari Nohem. So it's interesting because he wrote this book specifically for a few reasons. Firstly, he saw in his own milieu in Italy several people who he considered serious, Talmidei Chachamim, and people who are learned and of serious religious commitment and competence, I would say. They had started turning towards Kabbalah at the expense of rationalism, at the expense of learning Talmud and Halacha, etc. They became entranced by Kabbalistic work, including members of his own family, including his Talmud, Yosef Chamitz. And he saw this as a grave ideological threat to the kind of, I would say, more rationalist, more enlightened form of religion that he adopted. He also read the book, the Matzref LeChochma by Yashar Kandiel with great dismay. He thought that Kandiel was actually lying in the sense that he didn't believe that Kandiel really, or that Yashar really defended or really believed that the Kabbalah and the Zohar was that ancient. He thought his arguments were very flimsy. But also there was the influence at the time of Christian Kabbalists, which is something we haven't really mentioned before. There's actually a whole story of Zohar criticism and Zohar learning among the Christians. It's certain Renaissance humanists such as Pico, who I mentioned before, but also Johannes Reuchlin and others who read the Kabbalah, read the Zohar, really saw in there some great ancient Jewish and universal religious beliefs. And there was a whole back and forth in the Christian world. The problem was that Christians who were reading the Kabbalah and who were reading these texts did so for a missionary effect. In other words, they thought that by mastering the Kabbalah, they could seek to and often effectively convert Jews to Christianity. And therefore, Yehuda of Modena sought to combat this to the extent possible. So for these various reasons, he wrote down his Ari Nohem, which only deals with the Zohar for part of it, for about a third of the book, something like that. Anyone who wants a good book on this topic is Yaakov Dweck's The Scandal of Kabbalah, published by Princeton, I think. And that is basically the book on this topic. It gives a great background to Modena and goes through the Ari Nohem very well. So what does he argue in the Ari Nohem? So Modena, this is the sort of the major arguments. Firstly, he quotes seemingly for the first time, he quotes verbatim the whole story of Yitzhak Demin Akko in Sefer Yuchasim, right? Sefer Yuchasim wasn't so widespread, wasn't so well known, but Ari Nohem, after he quoted him and after he brought it in full, and he saw this as legitimate, full historical evidence by Yitzchak Akko that Moshe de Leon, as witnessed, as testified by his wife and daughter, didn't actually write the book himself. Didn't actually copy it from manuscript, rather wrote it entirely of his own accord. So that was one contribution of his. He then goes on to talk about, and I think this is his biggest contribution, that Ari Nohem then talks about the anachronisms in the Zohar. Anachronisms mean things that shouldn't be there. If it was in fact written in the 2nd century by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, there are many, many things in the Zohar which the Zohar shouldn't know about, which it shouldn't actually have, right? So, for instance, it shouldn't know about all sorts of events that happened later on, such as the rise of Islam, such as crusades, such as various other events and figures that occur in the centuries well after Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Okay. Also, it mentions later figures. We already said this. Mentions Amoraim, Rab Nachman, Rabbah, Rab Chia, etc., etc. Also, there are many later tefillas that only are Gaonic period, only from the Gaonic period, such as Nishmas Kol Chai, such as Keter Yitin Lecha. All of these are prayers that come later on, and these are mentioned in the Zohar. These are talked about in the Zohar. So how can it be the Zohar only knew about figures and historical events and compositions that occurred much later on? And he follows a little bit, one or two comments in the Ori Naim, Zari Jarasi's Ori Naim, which also hint to this. But this is actually this is the core of the historical argument against the Zohar, that it mentions many, many things that occurred centuries and centuries after the life of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his Talmidim. Now, just as an aside, the great counter-objection to this by those who believe in the antiquity of the Zohar is this is written by Ruach HaKodesh, right? How could it know things that happen in the future? Because he had Ruach HaKodesh, he could, and therefore, through this the use of this Holy Spirit, he could look into the future and talk and detail things that happen in the future. Again, as I mentioned in the first episode, as a historian, one can't disprove this. It's not something that is within the purview of the historian. There is no, I don't have evidence pro or con, figures of the Tannaitic period knowing things much later on. But again, this is something that is claimed. And the truth is, in order to maintain that claim, you have to say that not only did Rosh Bar Yochai and Establishment have this Ruach HaKodesh, but they were willing to talk about and outline very specific people, very specific periods, very specific things that happened in the centuries following the composition of the Zohar. So not only did they have a Ruach HaKodesh, but they were in fact willing to be extremely specific about things that would happen in the future, that things that would not, unlike books of Tanakh or unlike any other book that we claim has Ruach HaKodesh. Anyway, going on, he also names the Ari Nohem names various contradictions between halachic differences between the Talmud, between the halachot that are decided in the Talmud, and as against Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and as against those in the Zohar. There are several examples of this. And we've quoted that before. He also mentions a very interesting point, and again, a point that's picked up by many later critics of the Zohar, which is the very fact the Zohar is written in Aramaic. Right? Now, this is a very important point. Why? Because in the time of the Tanaim, the time they lived in Eretz Yisrael, Aramaic was simply the language of the street. It was the language used in the marketplace, or one of the languages, Greek as well, used in the marketplace, but it wasn't a language of scholarship. You don't find Tanaitic literature at all in the written in Aramaic, right? It's all written in Hebrew. The Mishnah is written in Hebrew, the Tanaitic Midrashim, it's all written, all the stuff is written in Hebrew. However, and therefore, Hebrew was the language of scholarship, and therefore it would have made sense not to write an esoteric work in the language of the street, of the common people, but rather in the language of scholarship, namely Hebrew, right? Whereas, in the time of Moshe de Leon, in 13th century Spain, Aramaic had become the language of scholarship. Judeo-Aramaic had become the language of, like today, it is a language of those who are very well versed in the Talmud. It is protected as an elite language, as it were, and therefore it makes much more sense to compose the book in Aramaic in 13th century Spain. It doesn't make sense to do such a thing in second century Eretz Yisrael. He doesn't go into depth. Later critics, as we'll see, will go into depth about the specific type of Aramaic used and the specific type of anachronistic language used, but he doesn't really go there. The Yehuda Arya of Modena, all he points out is that to the very fact that it's written in Aramaic points to its lateness, because only many centuries after Shimon Bar Yochai did Aramaic become a language in which any works of scholarship and any works of of Torah at all were written. So that's another point he makes. He also, extensively speaks about the gap. As I mentioned before, over 1,000 years. Another point that Yehuda Ari Modena makes, this is also very important, is that Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, the Zohar, reflects many ideas of medieval Jewish philosophy. Okay? In other words, if you go through the Zohar, you can find elements of the Rambam, you can find elements of Yehuda Halevi, you could find elements of Shmuel Hanagid, you could find elements of Ibn Gabirol. There are many figures whose works, ideas, sometimes even close to verbatim, are mentioned there. Now, if you believe in the antiquity of the Zohar, you could say, in theory, that all of these figures got their ideas from the Zohar. In other words, Rambam, Yehuda Halevi, Shmuel Nagid, etc., all these people knew about the Zohar, read the Zohar, and got a portion of their ideas from it. The problem with that being is that none of them ever mentioned it, right? In other words, you have to maintain there was a uniform, absolute silence on all of their part, and that, of course, figures like the Rambam and Rabbi Levi didn't take all of the Zohar's doctrines and ideas. They didn't, the Rambam in many ways is profoundly hostile to many of the Zohar's doctrines and ideas, but according to Ari Nohem, it makes much more sense to see this as a 13th century work that has already read all the parts of Jewish philosophy that have been composed in the 11th, 12th century, knows it, and weaves it into a creative new theology that is very matim, that is very applicable and fits in very well to the 13th century. It is a work very much of its time, according to Ari Nohem, because it complements the works of Jewish philosophy that were written, that were being read by intellectuals at the time, and that were being, that lay at the basis of Jewish theology as it was being formulated then at the time. Again, I want to reiterate what I said before. Despite all this, the Ari Nohem doesn't see the Zohar as Shadal would later see it, as a pernicious book, as something with a sort of a deleterious effect. Within Jewish history, on the contrary, he has respect for it. He thinks it's beautiful. He likes the aesthetics of the Zohar as well. He had a very strong aesthetic sensibility, and he appreciated that part of the Zohar, and he saw the Zohar as a late medieval midrash, which has some nice ideas and which is, a reservoir of excellent ideas and phrases and new doctrines which could be taught and discussed, but it doesn't have that kind of canonical weight as it might have had if it was written by a Tana in the 2nd century. That's a regel achad, the various different types of arguments put forth by the Ari Nohem, by Yehuda Ari Modena, and these are the arguments that will be taken up and expanded by later critics, as we shall see in due course.
Yeah, and so as you mentioned, Modena, you can, first of all, the edition Ari Nohem, so it was originally published, I said, in the 19th century. It was when it was published. There is a nice edition, the Leibowitz edition, which you can actually buy. I'll put a link to it. It's on Hebrew Books, pretty good quality scan, and it's available via Amazon for like $6.99 or something. And I'll put a link to that. So you can order it. And as you mentioned, JJ, it's not all about the Zohar. A lot of it, in fact, is not. Towards the middle, the latter part, he talks about the Zohar. And, as he just to read it, as he ends off, when he's talking about the Zohar, he says, as you mentioned, it's very sweet, pleasant to hear. My yafoi, my norm, how pleasant, how sweet it is. I praise it. It's a really wonderful work. For the past 300 years, this is the greatest work on Chumash. Basically, saying that it was written. So he says, he has a real affinity towards the book, but it wasn't Rosh Hashanah, which is an interesting way of him putting it. And
right.
And then Yaakov Dweck's book, The Scandal of Kabbalah, you can read about. He talks about this at length. Also, Professor Dweck is working on a translation, English edition of Ari Nohem. I have no idea how much longer that's still going to take. Something else interesting, though, to mention. This has come up in the past. Previously, we discussed print culture versus manuscript culture, even during the time of era of print. And Ari Nohem, we know, was a work that was studied and read and disseminated through manuscript. So even though it wasn't published, it was circulating, especially in Italy, a lot. And one of the ways that we see this also is the Chida, who has in his Magal Tov, which is his diary, his famous diary, did a podcast episode on that. It's really well worth reading. If anyone interested, a couple of new editions have come out in the past few years. He talks about different, some amongst the things in his travels. He mentions things that he saw. So when he's in Venice, Ridari Mother was in Venice. He's a rabbi in Venice. He says different things that he saw, and he mentions Sefer Remez, Remez Ksaviyad, Pirish Hazoyer, Pirish Mishnayis, Ksumes Vaksiba Tama. He talks about different things that he saw, and he saw the Ptesa Rosh, etc. He's talking about, and just to walk back, he's talking about some Kabbalistic stuff from Ramesh Zakud, etc. Then he says Ulahavdul ben Ha'or, and to separate from the light, Shamra Isi Sefer Ari Nohem. I also saw the work Ari Nohem. Right. Kuntris It's a contrast lechiach to prove shaz Zohar ena mirashpi. The Zohar is not rishim b'yechai v'chaver of rak mibacher v'chulu v'dvar of lo v'hayu kaloi hayu. And he's not happy with the Arinayim. And then, by the way, after he says the Sipur Isa Ish Vinyani Shabbos Tzvi. So then he talks about told us Yeshu, and then talking about seeing Shabbos Tzvi. He lumps it all together. But anyways, and he says V'Hagoda say they're kiddush b'kay for echlatz. He lumps all the ones that he doesn't like together. But the interesting thing about Arinayim is, and this is known, it was circulating in manuscript, and he saw this, and he saw a lot of manuscripts, but this is something that did circulate. This is a comment. I think he has, perhaps offhand, I'm trying to remember that maybe he has another comment about Arinayim, but that's definitely one. He does talk about, by the way, for those who are the Madonna, Chidan knew about all this. He talks about him, he talks about his other Sfarim, so he definitely knows of him, and so that's really, Madonna is really as you say, when you read it, what's interesting is preparing for this series that I really went through and read it, you hear about that he's the first. That's really the first real critique of the Zohar. But when you look at it, even notwithstanding the end, I mean, that's part of it, where he says, oh, it's really a beautiful book. I really enjoy it. Unlike others that are going to attack the Zohar, he also, it's not like this, it's very basic almost, to critique. It's certain things, but they get, you look at Yaakov Emden, and Yaakov Emden's going to subject the Zohar to much
it's not terrifically detailed.
Yeah, it's really not detailed. And you hear about it, and you read it, and you're like, well, it's not so detailed.
Right. In fact, I would say, look, as we're going to get to, I think the number one, the champion in this whole genre is definitely Shadal's Vikuach. We'll get there in a future episode. But the close runner-up, I think, is the Arinohim, because, as you say, it's not a very difficult read. These sort of late Renaissance Italians, they knew how to write beautifully, and they knew how to write in a manner that is, the arguments are fairly consistent, and you can follow it quite nicely. And yeah, I'd recommend those, as you say, who can get a printed copy from Hebrew Books and off Amazon. It's well worth the time and the effort. And again, to mention that, Yehuda Ari of Modena saw his arguments as well within the rabbinic tradition. In other words, later on we'll get to some maskilim or Wissenschaft scholars or whatever who were coming from this academically. But Yehuda Ari of Modena saw himself as fundamentally conservative, as protecting the rabbinic tradition from a book which he saw as perverting it, as introducing foreign ideas, as though they were central to the entirety of Jewish history, which he believes firmly they were not. And he believes he has the evidence, the receipts to prove it. So he sees this as a sort of anti-heretical, anti-Christian work, which seeks to defend the Jewish religion, as he does in many of his other works. And that's what makes it so interesting, is this tension between, on the one hand, that very conservative rabbinic, small c conservative rabbinic thrust, and also this quite daring critique of a book that by the time Yehuda Ari Modena was living, had already attained among many, a central place in their library.
The other thing about Arinayim that's unique is the book, unlike Bechinas Hadas, for example, of Dalmatic, was only a small part of the book where he's discussing this. Arinayim is a critique of Kabbalah, whether some parts of it, only some of it is the Zohar, but it is a critique of Kabbalah. So this becomes the book that the defenders of Kabbalah and of the Zohar are going to engage with. We should already mention here that really everyone is responding to him. So we'll have much later on, we'll get to Leo ben Amozek, which responds to Shadal, but his Emas Mafkia is responding to Arinayim. You'll have Reb David Luria and Reb Yitzchak Chaver and the Ramchal purportedly maybe in Chaykur Makubal, and you have the Radzina Rebbe and others that are writing defenses, and they're really against this. I'm Shemer and Munim to some extent, because we're going to get to right here shortly. These are all engaging with Madonna. They're all really fighting back and pushing back on him and on his critique of Kabbalah and of Zohar. So in that sense, it's really a foundational work in this controversy, in this discussion about the authenticity of Zohar and Kabbalah.
Correct, because as you say, unlike Yaakov Emden, unlike others later on, he specifically attacks the entirety of Kabbalah. That is his. That is what he's going for. Okay. Yes. So in the century or two following, or the century between a century or more between Leo Modena and Rav Yaakov Emden, who we'll get to next episode, there were a few who wrote responses to Leo Modena, to the Arinohim. I will mention a couple of them. I'll give a couple of honorable mentions. There's the Emunat Chachamim of Aviad Sar Shalom Basilia. That was in the early 18th century. Very anti-philosophical work. Again, an interesting work. We don't have time to go go on about it here. There's also the Mogen V'Tzina of Rav Yitzchak Isaac Chaver, who also worth reading, although not as interesting as some of the other ones we'll talk about. So, put that to one side. And there's also a book written ostensibly by the Ramchal called Choker Umukubal, right, which presents itself as a response to the Ari Nohem. The only problem is that the scholarly academic consensus nowadays is that actually wasn't written by the Ramchal. There's a small cottage industry within scholarship today of trying to figure out of the many, many manuscripts of books that claim to be written by the Ramchal, which are indeed the Ramchal and which are not the Ramchal. And Choker Mukubal, it's a very short work. It's a pretty small dialogue, but it's quite clear apparently to those who are experts in this topic that this is in fact a work of pseudepigraphy. This is not in fact written by the Ramchal, and therefore I'm not going to pay too much attention to it because who knows who wrote it. By the way, I'm very happy. When I interviewed on my podcast, I interviewed Jonathan Garb, an expert on this, a professor of Hebrew U and Kabbalah, and he told me that Choker Mukubal is not considered to be among the true Ramchal canon. I was very happy because when I was reading the Choker Mukubal, I was reading it and I was thinking, this doesn't sound like the Ramchal. This is second-rate stuff. Like I've read other Ramchal stuff. Ramchal's a serious figure. Choker Mukubal is not worthy of standing around the Ramchal. And when it was confirmed later on, this is in fact a forgery, I was actually quite happy. So it's a book worth knowing about. I wouldn't say it's a book worth reading.
Yeah, I think there are some that want to say it is the Ramchal. I mean, it's again, if you get the edition, so these are also available online. I believe it comes with the Sefer Mogen V'Tzina, but as a cover, they include it. It's like included together. It's appended together. There actually was a volume that had all of it. Was years ago. Somebody published together the Kadma Sefer Zer of David Luria with the Zer Akib Rucham liner, the Retziner, with the Mogen V'Tzina as a cover, with that Ramchal. So we kind of recreated for this from the printout, the downloaded version. But there's now it's not that volume isn't available.
Right.
You mentioned Emunas Chacham or Vias Hashem Basilia. The interesting there is a new edition of that Zechron Aaron, and they actually. It's different from we're going to talk about Matpachas. Matpachas of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, which will be next episode. The other half of that book was written on Emunas Chachamim, so they put that in the new edition on the bottom, like as notes. But it's not the part on the Zohar. That part has been redone, but it's impossible to get, and it's unfortunate if you can get the new edition of that. But we'll leave Rabbi Yaakov Emden aside for a second, and then get back to Shemer Amunim. Who else do we still have to discuss in this period? Before
there's one, right? Yes, the one person I still want to discuss in this episode is, in fact, the Shomer Emunim, or sometimes called the Shomer Emunim Hakadmon.
Which, by the way, there's a pet peeve. Every time it comes on the podcast, I have to say this. Shomer Emunim Hakadmon. It's like you take someone, there's a Rebbe, Shomer Emunim. I'm not belittling you in any way, the Shomer Emunim. And so they take the Shomer Emunim, and they say, oh, therefore he's Shomer Emunim Hakadmon. Like as if he's like, you do this to the Tzemach Tzedek. They do it Tzemach Tzedek and the Tzemach Tzedek Hakadmon of Nicholsburg. Like, what? Why? I don't know. I don't understand why that happened. But anyways.
Now, might I say, as pet peeves go, that's very unique to you.
I think many people. I know it's a very geeky pet peeve. I get
it. A nerdy bibliophile's pet peeve. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this. Okay, fine. So this was written by an Italian Kabbalist and halachist called Yosef Ergas in the early 18th century. So he lived in Livorno, died in 1730. He was a fierce anti-Sabbatean. We'll talk a little bit about Shabbat more next episode when we do Rav Yaakov Emden. But he was part of this sort of, I would say, mini industry of heresy hunting for the anti-Sabbatean and sniffing out those who use Kabbalah in that direction of Shabbat. Interestingly enough, just as a sort of a fun fact, he was one of the figures who was consulted about when the Ramchal was put on trial. So he was put on trial a couple of times. When he was put on trial, I think it was in Amsterdam, they sent his works to a couple of figures to adjudicate, is this young, 20-something-year-old who ostensibly is a great Kabbalist, is he the real deal? Or is he, a forger and a fraud who needs to be excommunicated? So they sent it to Yosef Ergas. Unfortunately, Yosef Ergas died in 1730 before he could pronounce his his psak one way or another on whether the Ramchal was the real deal or not. But anyway, so he wrote a dialogue, interestingly. The two protagonists of the dialogue called She'altiel and Yehoyada. I'm sure I don't need to enlighten an audience like yours as to which is asking the questions and which is giving the answers of She'altiel, and Yehoyada. But what's interesting about this book is that it's not. It is a response to Ari Nohem and to the doubters, but it's also not. In other words, he doesn't try and refute them point by point. That's not what the Shomer Emunim does. What the Shomer Emunim actually trying to do is essentially a rear guard action, right? A rear guard action in parrying various objections to Kabbalah and various, I would say, misunderstandings, potential possibly misunderstandings of Kabbalah. And basically the point of the book is, firstly, to show that Kabbalah, certainly Kabbalah since the Ari, no longer has any major arguments, right? In other words, one of the issues, and critics, especially Shadal and others, of the Kabbalah will say is that from its first days, there are serious arguments or serious disagreements within and among the Kabbalists. And what the Shomer Emunim HaKadmon tries to do is tries to put this all to bed, right? And know that Kabbalah is in fact fully homogeneous. There are no true arguments. There's a lot of misunderstanding and misinterpretation, but actually it's not the case. It also tried to, I don't want to say rationalize, but maybe ideologically purify to a certain degree Kabbalah, certainly post-Lurianic Kabbalah. So what I mean by that is to clarify firstly the Sfirot are absolutely created. They are not part of the Ein Sof. They are actually created entities fully. They're not part of Atzmut, of the divine essence itself, right? Also that they are not physical in any way. That Tzimtzum is to be read non-literally. And of course, these have been disputed at various times. But the point being that the Shomer Emunim HaKadmon tries to give a portrait of Kabbalah and of Kabbalistic doctrines, which is firstly very understandable, readily comprehensible, but also amenable to, let's say, your average religious person. I have to say, it's quite a nice read, Shomer Emunim HaKadmon. It's written quite well. And there's a recent good edition of it by by his fellow Avinoam Frankel, who gave extensive footnotes and massive chapters. It's like it turns a 100-page book into a 1,000-page book, which is a real a talent, I would say. And I know you want to say something about Znachi, but before you do, I'm going to say the one part of the book of Frankel's rendition, which was very unsatisfactory, was the introductory chapter in which he talks about opposition to the Kabbalah. In other words, he should have listened to this 5-part series before he did that chapter, because he would have been aware of many of the objections of many of the personalities and many of the elements which which he didn't write about, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely pro-Kabbalah. It's a really nice edition. Avinoam Frankel did. I was supposed to do a podcast with him. It never came out, so hopefully, perhaps this will be the impetus that'll end up doing it. I'll link to that in the show's notes as well. And there's also a really nice edition. Sometimes it's available, sometimes not, in Hebrew. If you just want the Hebrew nice text, Avat Shalom did, Shomer Emunim. They actually did his other sefer, I think, Minchas Yosef. And then recently his Chuvas came out, Divrei Yosef, that was published by Zohar. So some of his stuff has been coming out. Maybe it's Kol HaKadmon, again, going back to my pet peeve, because he's not so well known, even though he should be, but he's not. So you can get the Shomer Emunim in Hebrew or the Hebrew English. Actually, I think it's just English, the Frankel's edition, so you can get either one. And he was friends with Manu Chayriki, who give him a mention here, a shout out here. Manu Chayriki, the Meshach Chasidim, he doesn't play a part in this role, but he is he's killed, like Hashem, he's murdered by some troops and dumped into a ditch, and there's a whole story for a different time. Manu Chayriki, the Meshach Chasidim, but he had a different kind of Kabbalistic outlook, but he was also a Kabbalist at the same time. The Rabach is in Italy as a Rebbeinu Cohen, Chai Vitali. So there's a lot of different things, a lot of Kabbalah going on in Italy. But yes, the Shomer Emunim is part of this, and he plays a role in this. And it is, and often, interestingly, often as these farm go, they're dialogues. They're written as dialogue. We'll get to Shadal's a dialogue. Yes. Written as a dialogue. They're often these dialogues.
Yes. Choker Mukubal as well. So yes, this is true. But there are, however, a few points within Shomer Emunim which seem to be quite clearly oriented towards some of the objections brought up by the Arino Hem and others. And that is, and they're worth mentioning here. Again, it isn't presented as this, but it is aware of this and does seem to be against the first. Forgive me. The first is that Kabbalah, according to the author Shomer Emunim, is quite dangerous, right? It is easily misinterpreted, either theologically or practically, and thus for all the centuries between Rishon Bar Yochai and until it was published, it was necessary to hide it from most people. Okay, it was necessary to hide the doctrines, to hide the texts from most people. Why? Because if it came out, then it could be very dangerous. And of course, he's living in the post-Sabbatean era, and so it is quite clear that what Kabbalah can be if taken to certain extremes, if read in certain ways, and therefore most people, even great figures within the Jewish tradition, they'd never heard of this. They didn't have it, right? And that, of course, addresses the gaps problem, right? The idea of the 1,100 years of complete silence, because according to him, the circles were very small, very tight. Many figures, including the Rambam, didn't have it. Now, this is interesting. He actually has a couple of chapters in there attacking the Rambam quite a lot for his philosophy, for his, he didn't know mysticism, and anyway, a lot of his philosophy has been disproved. And anyway, he repeats this Baba Maisa that the Rambam, learned Kabbalah towards the end of his life and repented, and okay, whatever, put that to one side. But the point being that he believed that actually some of the great figures in the history of Klal Yisrael missed the boat with Kabbalah, and that's why you don't hear about it, and that's why it was always very small. It also attacks philosophy quite, certainly medieval philosophy quite strongly, and follows the Rabbi Yehuda Halevi line that don't expect any coherence or seriousness out of the philosophers. They all disagree with each other, and they can never reach any firm conclusion anyway. And he takes that line, except for the few instances in which Kabbalah and philosophy do in fact converge, which is useful for him. We'll talk a bit more about that later. And he also tries to close the gap, that 1100-year gap between Rishon Bar Yochai and Moshe DeLeon, by showing that actually at various points in the Gemara and in the Midrashim and the early Gaonim, there are hints to various mystical elements. And there's a comment here and a point there and this and that. Basically, he's trying to show that any of these mystical mentions do refer, in fact, to Torah Tason, which he equates with full Kabbalah. However, as I began this series by mentioning, that this isn't necessarily the case. In other words, the mysticism that may have been around the Talmudic period or the Gaonic period or other times is not necessarily that same mysticism that erupted in Provence and France and Spain in the 12th, 13th century. So that is, but however, he obviously, because he sees a straight line of ideational coherence, right? That he believes it was the same ideas and the same doctrines from the beginning all the way to the end. So he tries to detail this in some important respect. Actually, it's interesting what he wrote about the Rambam and others that did not, great sages, great chachamim in Jewish history who weren't aware of Kabbalah, who didn't receive the good news, as it were, because this is actually a bit of an issue within and among those who maintain the Kabbalah is in fact ancient and that the Zohar was written by Rishon Bar Yochai, because then you have to come up with, okay, so why is it that so many figures not only seem not to have heard of it, but in fact seem to have ideas that are opposed to it, right? Why is that the case? And there are one of a couple of answers you can go. Either you can say, no, they had heard of it, but they expressed themselves otherwise, or you could say like the Shomer Muno Kadmon and say, no, Rambam had never heard of it, Rambam didn't have a teacher, Rambam didn't know about it, and basically either way you go, it's a little bit uncomfortable. And in fact, I probably should have mentioned this a bit earlier, but one of the things that Yashar of Kandia and Yudari of Modena, one of the things they fight about is Saadia Gaon, actually, the figure Saadia Gaon. Why? And I think it's important to note, certainly for your listeners, it's a little bit underappreciated just how central a figure in Jewish history Saadia Gaon was, certainly in the production of Jewish ideas, right? He was the Rosh Yeshiva of Sura, the Gaon, the Rosh Yeshiva of Sura, at the time when the Babylonian Gaonate was at the very peak of its powers. He was the first one to write a book of Jewish philosophy, right? He was and basically invented that genre. He was the first one to write a line-by-line Pirush al Torah. We didn't have that before Zadok, right? He was the first one really to write, in the rabbinic tradition, to write serious books and put his name on them as coherent, as actual books in and of themselves. He was the first one. He pioneered the halachic monograph. There are many areas and many areas of activity in which Saadia Gaon was the pioneer, and also he was quite simply the I wouldn't say undisputed, because his life was very much disputed and his leadership was much disputed, but he was, both in his generation and later on, the ultimate authority. And not only does Saadia Gaon never mention Kabbalah, not only is his philosophy seemingly opposed to Kabbalah, but there are certain doctrines, for example, Gilgul, reincarnation, which Saadia Gaon specifically writes against. And in his Emunah, he specifically says this is a foreign idea and it's nonsense and mustn't be believed in, etc., etc. And the question is, so those who want to defend Kabbalah as something that is ancient and that was passed in secret throughout Chachamim for over 1,000 years before the Zohar. So what do you do with that? What do you do with a figure like Saadia Gaon? So if you are Yashar of Kandia, you say, no, Saadia Gaon did know about Kabbalah, he just didn't express himself in Kabbalistic ways, and he wanted to preserve the secret, so he wrote other things. But in truth, of course, Saadia Gaon, because how can the Rosh Yeshiva of Surah, how can the Gadol Hadar not know about Kabbalah? That doesn't make any sense. Whereas the other side, the other possibility is the Shomer Emunim HaKadmon option, in which you say, no, Kabbalah was actually preserved among very small circles of initiates, and you can have great figures such as a Rambam. He doesn't mention Saadia Gaon, interestingly. I didn't see anywhere in the show when he mentioned Saadia Gaon, but you can have figures, major figures like the Rambam, the greatest of all, who nonetheless weren't privy to the secrets, and therefore their philosophies of Judaism are massively lacking. But either way, the absence of Kabbalah from some of the major figures in the centuries prior to the publication of the Zohar is a very uncomfortable fact for those who try and defend the antiquity of the Zohar. But as I say, there are different solutions, and people try and get around it in different ways. That's a major interesting distinction between various different defenders of the Kabbalah in this regard.
Yes, and so I think that's the end of episode 2.
Yes, I think we'll draw a circle there, and then we'll go on to the 18th century, in which there is an enormous amount of interesting material.
Yes, there's going to be a lot of material there. Yaakov Emden will spend a lot of time with Matpachas. My copy has many sticky notes and many underlined many things.
Excellent.
I don't want to. We're not going to go through the whole Matpachas, but there's going to be a lot of things to talk about with Yaakov Emden and Ramesh Kunitz and his defense of Sefer Ben Yechai, and so on and so forth. So do stay tuned for episode 3, and thank you, JJ, for joining me for episode 2.
Excellent. Looking forward. All the best.